Welcome back to Neurodiverse Christian Couples. I'm Stephanie, and as the intro said, usually it is Stephanie and Dan, but for today's topic, it is just me, Stephanie, and my guest is Sarah McDugal. Thank you for being on the podcast today, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I'm excited. We're going to have a good conversation.
Yes, you were listener recommended. I got emails when I put out something saying, what guest should I have? Sarah McDugal, Sarah McDugal, Sarah McDugal. So I'll explain why. There's many reasons why I'm so glad you're on the show. Listeners, let me tell you a little bit about Sarah. She is co-founder of Wilderness to Wild and the TraumaMAMAs mobile app. She's an author, coach, survivor, and trauma mama. She is an autistic woman and survivor of both domestic violence and childhood sexual assault. Her hyper-focus is developing gentle, proven resources for women who want to heal after toxic and traumatic stress. And you are also APSATS certified. We've had others on here, Shauna Meek and Dr. Porter, who are also APSATS. And we have some listeners' questions. So we've got a lot to cover in our time today. So I'd love to start with your story. In many cases, people's story and trauma inform their work and calling. So start us back a little bit with your story.
Well, I was raised in a very conservative, you would call it kind of fundy, but very loving Christian home. Now, I know for a lot of people, those two things don't go together. But my parents, while we were extremely conservative, actually had a very healthy, and still do, healthy, balanced, loving, equal marriage. And my parents weren't really raised a particular strong Christian denomination or belief system. They were sharecroppers kids from Central Arkansas Delta that got married when my mama was a junior in high school. And 3 weeks after the wedding, my daddy shipped to Vietnam for a year and mom stayed home and finished high school. And then they lived all over because my dad was career military for a while, a number of years. And but they were just country kids and a kind of your salt of the earth. Mom was the youngest of 12. Dad's the oldest of 5. They were driving tractor and chopping cotton by the time they were 10, just old-fashioned farm kids. So in their early 30s, around the time I was born, they met some people who introduced them to a very different way of life. And it was very appealing. It seemed very inclusive of family and generations. And it also happened to be more of a high control religion. And they were warmly enveloped into this group. And they were drawn more and more conservative into increasingly high control circles, but that wasn't their roots. So I'm trying to paint a little bit of a picture. So they had actually quite balanced, healthy roots, and that showed up in their marriage. They've been together now. It's like, let me see, 1969. So like 55 years. And then they dated 3 years before that. They've been together way longer than they were ever apart. And so I grew up watching them support each other and watching them just have each other's back and interact, and watching my parents live out a very healthy, loving marriage. And our home was very peaceful and warm and caring. Mom stayed home. We homeschooled. And I think we homeschooled through 10th grade. And then we ended up moving overseas when I was in my early teens as missionaries. So I grew up autistic, but not knowing it, and largely comfortable with myself because we spent a lot of time with other families who were kind of a lot like us. So I didn't know I was that different until I was actually like in 11th grade. And we had a lot of downtime and a lot of low sensory time. We always lived out in the country, and we had a big garden, and we had pets, and it was probably an ideal. If I could go pick a type of childhood for the kind of person I am, many things from my childhood would be exactly that. However, I also grew up pretty innocent and naive. And I believed, just by osmosis, I suppose, that everyone's family was like mine. It didn't occur to me that parents might fight, or that people might be really unkind to each other, or that compulsive lying might be something that people did, because it was just not a part of my childhood and youth on any level. So in college, I dated and married a theology major and became a pastor's wife. And what I didn't know is that I had unwittingly married a porn and sex addict with already a decade plus of raging addiction, and who was a profoundly compulsive liar and was already very skilled at living two separate lives and compartmentalizing everything. So we got married. He went to get his master's of divinity. I got my master's. Things just were hard, and I couldn't figure out why. Nobody over 20 years ago was talking about addiction, exploitation, the escalation of compulsive entitled sexuality. Nobody was discussing the harm and the emotional and psychological shattering that happens to young wives when they discover that this is going on, or even if they don't know, because of the manipulation and the isolation and the deception and the intimidation and all of the swirl of things that happens in this vortex that you're living in. And so after, well, it was close to 7 years before we had kids, I found out about the porn 1 year in. But I had no idea how pervasive it was or what a problem porn was. I didn't know really what porn was besides the dictionary definition. So I was kind of thinking just like sexy pictures of girls. I didn't understand the trafficking side, the exploitation side, the violence, the rape, the aggression. I had no reference point for any of that. And it was also presented, once I discovered it, as something that was like a little slip. Like I just saw a sexy picture kind of thing. So I had no idea what I was actually dealing with. I also had no one as a young pastor's wife to safely talk to, because when you're a ministry spouse, when you're married to a community leader, you end up like having to weigh this dilemma on a tightrope. And so you're walking this tightrope between, do I talk to someone to get help, or do I blow up my family's livelihood? If I say something, my spouse may not have a job. But if I don't say something, it's going to stay just like this. But if I say something, the shame will be so great, and nobody will look at me or him that same way again. But if I don't say something, man, what if it never gets better? Maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it's all in my head. Maybe I'm just not cooperative enough. Maybe I should just lose 10 pounds. Maybe I should be sexier. Maybe I should change my hair color. Maybe I should just not have an opinion. On all of those topics, I just shouldn't have had an opinion. So you tell yourself all of these things, and you, especially 20 years ago, when there was nothing out there for this. So over a decade passed, and then we had 2 little kids. And eventually he got caught with more than just unsavory content on a church computer. And at that point, our lives blew up in my face. And very shortly after that, I was a homeless, jobless, solo parent of 2 autistic preschoolers. I didn't know that our family was neurodivergent yet. That came a little bit later. But I was 34 years old and desperately trying to figure out which way was up. and how to rebuild from the aftermath of the house that I thought we had built together, figuratively speaking, the family, the structure, the social network, everything having just burned down around my ears. So I was just left sorting through the rubble with blisters on my hands, trying to figure out what is salvageable, what is actually true, what's a lie, what was never real, and who am I? How do I go forward from here?
That's a lot.
It was a lot.
That is a lot. I'm just sitting here thinking so many things that anyone who's listening and they've been in ministry, mission work, on staff, you're definitely living in a fishbowl.
Yep.
Definitely organizations or districts or lines of authority and communication. I have a lot of friends who are ministers, and they're like, that's kind of one of the most isolated places, because who do you talk to? Who is the safe person? Who just wants my job or my husband's job? Who really wants to help us, right? So there's so many facets that keep a woman stuck: the pastor's wife, the missionary's wife, the staff member's wife. And then there's this secondary trauma, because some women tell me the reason they stay in the abusive relationship isn't like for the sake of the children, like because we have kids, we stay together, but I don't want this person to have 24, 48, or 72 hours of unsupervised visitation with my child. So that sometimes keeps a person in an abusive relationship, because I can't do anything for those 72 hours. Was that any part of the kind of the story of staying, or like
Well, for me, this was happening nearly a decade ago. And at the time, I was completely unaware of the state of the court system. I genuinely and very naively thought that you show up, you show the proof of addiction and sexual indiscretion and acting out. And the court would just say, well, that's not a fit parent. And then you're done. You just show up, tell the truth, and people keep you safe. And I had no idea what I was getting into. So as time moved on, I discovered that was not at all the situation. And I ended up spending a number of years in custody litigation after the divorce was final, for the purpose of protecting my kids. But I was already out before I realized that unsupervised time sharing and parenting was even a thing in a situation like this. So I was very, very innocent on that front. I now work with strategic coaching for women who are in that, because I learned a lot over that decade about how to work with the system that is. But yeah, I learned it the hard way, because I didn't know any of that at first. But yes, after a few years of not having contact, when contact was reintroduced by the court system, I was immobilized in terror for my kids. I remember just not being able to breathe. I remember one time going to a meeting with the attorney that I had at the time and coming back. And it had been so jarring that I just went and got in the shower as hot as I could stand it. And I ended up curled up in a fetal position on the floor of the shower, because it was the only place I could cry as hard as I needed to and not have my kids know.
Yeah. And I think it's a good place to add that as we kind of continue down the story that you and I both discussed before recording, that we are both pro-marriage, pro for covenant, but as Leslie Vernick would say, not to the detriment of the sanity and safety of individuals within the marriage. And so that's kind of what we're talking about, is it became unsafe. And then this extra layer of this ministry layer, which is in many ministry organizations, it might be set up that the person who was the minister or the missionary is, the employed one. And so if there's benefits or retirement, it's going to, by definition, go to the husband. And that's not a civil lawyer thing that you can do because it's coming through a religious organization. And that makes it even more difficult for a woman in that situation.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to reiterate that I am absolutely for marriage. I am for healthy, thriving, caring, loving, safe relationships. I believe that the benchmark for a healthy, thriving, God-honoring marriage are the fruits of the Spirit. And those apply equally to both people.
And all neurotypes.
And all neurotypes. So the basis for a healthy, loving marriage is love and joyfulness and peacefulness and patience and kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. And those are really like a number of words that describe the vows, right? I am faithful to you, setting aside all others. I will love and cherish and honor you. That's loving and peaceful and patient and joyful. I will make you my priority. And that is not the wife's vows or the husband's vows. That is the baseline of what we are called to be as followers of Jesus Christ. And so there is no exception. There's no carve out. This is unless you're married to them and then you can be a complete jerk. Or unless you're married to them and then you don't actually have to be honest anymore. And they're stuck with you. And you can just do whatever you want. You can hurt them. You can beat them. You can lie to them. You can defame the name of God in any way. God says that we are called to reflect his character in the fruits of the Spirit. And I have a whole Bible study on what makes an unbeliever, because if someone is acting abusively and harmfully, then the question is, are they actually exhibiting the fruits of the Spirit and living as a believer? Or do we have a different question to ask ourselves here? But all that to say, I am fiercely pro-marriage and pro-family and pro-safety for all parties involved.
And as a person on the spectrum, well, I want to get into your diagnosis and how you figured that out. But some people want to use maybe the spectrum as like I get a pass. Sometimes like, oh, I hear you say all the say fruit of the Spirit and self-control and all that, but I'm on the spectrum. And so I can't do self-control. I'm just not kind. That's just not part of who I am. That's just not my makeup. So how do you speak to that as part of that community?
Well, I strongly believe that being on the spectrum, being neurodivergent, being autistic you get a 0 pass for not being a decent human. Now, you may process information differently. You may feel and show your feelings differently. You may have slower response time, or you may have faster response time, depending on your auditory and sensory processing power and issues and disorders or strengths. You may be really incredible in like these 1 or 2 areas of your hyper focus, but outside of your special interests, you may struggle. And we are all called to be decent humans. So I don't see any pass in the gospel that says, unless you're neurodivergent, and then you can just be a jerk. And I also don't see anywhere that God says or hints that people who are of a different neurotype are somehow immune to the restoring power of salvation and the gospel. Because there are plenty of neurotypical people who are complete jerks. And they are called to choose not to be that way and to build different habits. And there are plenty of autistic people or spectrum neurodivergent people who may be complete jerks. And there are also incredibly kind, empathetic, deeply loyal, and big-hearted autistic and spectrum people. I know a ton of them. So whether you are a person who is neurodivergent and on the spectrum, if you're using that as a pass for yourself, that's deflection, that's refusing to take responsibility, and you are choosing to be abusive. Autism doesn't make you abusive. Now, are there skills for people of certain neurotypes that come harder? Yes. Flexibility with transitions can be a really hard skill. I have a couple of kiddos who really struggle with that. On the other hand, we talk a lot about how cultivating the ability to decide to be flexible with transitions is a crucial skill for success in today's world. And it may not come naturally to you. But that's okay. Some people don't have a map in their head of everywhere they've ever been, like you do. It doesn't come naturally to them. When my kids were diagnosed, they had a fantastic developmental pediatrician who was also a very godly woman, and we just loved her. And she was very pro telling kids their diagnosis, and I was fine with that. So she sat down and I got to observe her telling my kids, and they were like 6 and 7. So really young, but not teeny tiny, old enough to be involved in this conversation. And she told them, so there's something different about you. And they're like, yeah, we know, which I knew they knew, which was one of the reasons why I wanted them to have their diagnosis, because they knew they were different. They just didn't know why. And telling them why, I felt was a really positive thing. So she told them, you have this thing about your brain that's different. You have a super cool brain. Your brain is like a lot of the people in the world who have made some of the most amazing inventions and written some of the most amazing music and done some of the most amazing scientific experiments. And you have a brain like inventors and engineers that make history. And this also means that there's going to be some things that are really easy for other kids your age that are really hard for you. Like how to get other people to do what you want them to do, or switching from one class period to the next at school. Those are going to seem really easy for other kids your age, and it's really going to suck for you. It's going to be very hard, and you're going to have to learn the skills to be able to cope with this. And then there's going to be things that you're going to have a special interest in, and you're going to learn all about all the things about this, and other people aren't going to have all that information, and those topics won't come easily for other people your age. So you win some, you lose some. And just like they would have to work really hard to be as good as you are at this other special interest, you're going to have to work really hard at some things that come easy for them. So she was just so matter of fact about it and told them straightforward, the most important thing is humility and kindness. If you're just willing to learn from people and admit your mistakes, just be humble and kind. Sounds like a Tim McGraw song, but just
wait a minute. I think we've heard that.
Yeah, I know, right? I always say humble and kind. Anyway, but she's just like, just humility and kindness and honesty. Those are the 3 things you need to be respected, to be well-liked, and to be a success in life, no matter how different you are from all the people around you. So for us, that was my introduction to, hey, my kids are autistic. That was the foundation we stepped into this on. It had never occurred to me that I was autistic or on the spectrum at all. Wasn't on my radar at all, because I was the really good kid. And I grew up with a lot of the stereotypes, like autistic kids are like the little boy in the corner who's like rocking back and forth and won't let anybody touch him. That was what my head thought, that's just what I had assumed based on ill-informed stereotypes. So when I realized that my highly gifted, highly articulate, hyperlingual, hyperlexic children were actually on the autism spectrum, I started thinking back to all the things that they had inherited from me. And funny enough, the things that they had inherited from me were all the things getting them these diagnoses. And so that was a little bit of an adjustment in expectations. I already had discovered that I was INTJ and that less than 1% of the women in the world have the INTJ personality profile. So for me, since I'd already discovered that, I thought, oh, that's why I felt like a fish out of water socially my whole life. That's why I'm so different. That's why I've always felt like an outsider looking in with other women, because I could always talk with men or guys about like real stuff. No offense to all my ladies, but like I could talk theology and philosophy and science and archaeology and history and whatever with guys. And the girls were like, let's swap bounty recipes. And I just didn't have any use for that. So I felt like I was kind of just never fit in with women. When I discovered I was INTJ, I was like, oh, well, that explains everything. The autism layer was just a whole nother revelation on top of already having discovered that. So all of that combines, we didn't understand anything about our neurodivergence until after we were a solo parent family. So all of this came after our lives blew up and it was just me and my kids. And we were fortunate to be able to connect with some really, really incredible providers who taught me a lot about how to advocate for my kids. Because being a neurodivergent family, going through divorce, losing your church community, feeling ostracized as a former clergy spouse, recognizing that your family is not just different from everyone else because your family life blew up, because your marriage blew up in your face, but also because you have all of these other neurodivergence layers going on. That was a lot to process. And that doesn't even get into the trauma layers of dealing with trauma as a parent and dealing with trauma in your children and helping them to heal.
So many layers, man. We could go so deep into that, but
there's China somewhere on the other side of this hole that we're digging.
Right? Yeah, like we could keep going. So with all of that, and then navigating the divorce from a ministry situation, losing church community, discovering neurodivergency, and then all the advocacy. While I'm neurotypical, I have a daughter on the spectrum. And so I also naively thought, oh, we have a diagnosis. You go to school, you tell them, you have this nice, lovely IEP meeting. We come out with goals. And I was like, we're going to work together. That was not the case, So
cheers to that.
Wouldn't it be nice if the world worked in a collaborative way? But so through all of that, this in the ministry world, I want to kind of talk about that piece because two reasons that women I work with stay when it's gotten beyond toxic and abusive, and is one is the kids, this unsupervised time. I just can't bear the thought. But the other thing is, in certain denominations and faith traditions, the only out is provable adultery. Like you've got to have a private investigator photos like proof, or some kind of confession that there was adultery, or you are the one essentially excommunicated from the church community. So I want to talk about what it feels like, having gone through an abusive situation. You have young kids, you're leaving the ministry, which is your profession, and the loss of church community. That's its own trauma. Would you kind of speak to that a little bit?